is chapter 15. We are talking about marijuana today. Marijuana, of course, is an interesting topic right now. I had you guys watch some videos at the very beginning of this semester on marijuana, and it's continuously changing legal status. Okay. Now, as marijuana's legal status continues to change, we will look and see new issues. Okay. And I use the word issues rather than problems because there are pros and cons of legalizing really anything. Okay. So there are new issues surrounding if you are using marijuana, where are you allowed to use it? When are you allowed to use it? How are you allowed to use it? Are you shouldn't use it when you're driving. And then, of course, educating the public on this new drug, right? It's not just, okay, there's a new thing that's legal, let's go use it without thinking about it. If you are interested, there are some advertisements that have come out, specifically in Colorado, that the idea is they're telling people not to get high and drive, okay? And they're really quite clever advertisements. Again, I think you can probably YouTube or Google these things, and they're kind of funny because they show sort of somebody, for example, playing basketball high, and then talking about like not driving while you're high, right? Because those things can be dangerous. There's also other issues of just, okay, what ages are we okay with this? What are actually the long-term effects? You know, what we do know about it is fairly limited, okay? So everybody has an opinion on marijuana. Everybody has an opinion. I'm not really that interested in opinions on this topic. I'm interested in the data. I'm interested in facts. I'm not anti-marijuana. I'm not like going out and, telling everybody they should use marijuana. That's not a very good scientific way of doing things. So let's talk facts. Cannabis. There is the cannabis plant. Okay, marijuana is the preparation of the leafy material from the cannabis plant that's usually smoked. There are 3 species. So we have our cannabis sativa. This is primarily used for its fibers, and that is hemp rope, and hemp products are made out of that. It's a different species than what marijuana comes from, okay? Cannabis indica, that is grown for its psychoactive resins, and that's what we usually call marijuana, okay? And then there's Cannabis ruderalis, and that primarily grows in Russia, right? So, moving on here. Preparations, so THC, all right? You want to know that THC is the primary psychoactive agent in cannabis, okay? THC is the primary psychoactive ingredient in cannabis, okay? It is that concentrated resin that is on the flowering parts of the plant. Now, the potency of cannabis preparations really depends on the amount of resin that is present, and this can vary greatly, okay? So if you have heard of somebody smoking marijuana at one time and feeling a certain way, and smoking marijuana another time but the same amount and feeling different, this is because of the potency can be very dramatically different, okay? Most of the resin is in that flowering tops of the plant, less so in the leaves, and very little in the fibrous stalks, okay? So there's that. Then there's hashish. So hashish is a little bit different, and you can see this picture here that doesn't look like your typical marijuana. Hashish is the most potent preparation. In its purest form, it consists of pure resin that has been carefully removed from the surface of the leaves and stems. People typically take a little bit of hashish and put it maybe on top of the marijuana that they're going to smoke, or use it in different ways. But you would need a very small amount compared to the amount of those flowering plant resins that you would have. It's fairly rare in the U.S., but not that rare. About 1% of confiscated marijuana samples are hashish. Okay. So this is a picture down here. If you are not familiar with this, this is a picture of those flowering buds that are on the cannabis plant. And if you look at it closely, you can see that there's different, like what I'm talking about, sort of the resins on there. When you do see marijuana, you'll see, depending on the purity and how well it was grown and how it was grown and different types of things, you will see kind of that looks like sparkly things on it, or kind of purplish colors in it, or just the brown and green colors, and different things. And that people that know marijuana well can tell which different types of marijuana they're looking at by the smell and what they see when they look at these flowering tops. I do mention all this because of the changing in the legal status. Now when you go into a store that sells marijuana, you will see a lot of different types of choices, And there is a connoisseur element to it in the same way that we have wines or craft beers, okay? Again, these are just facts. So watch out for like opinions that you have that sneak in while I'm talking, okay? All right, Sinsemilla is the second most potent preparation. It consists of dried flowering tops of plants, and that is the female plants. The average THC content is about 11%, but like I said, it changes. It's pretty different. So, I mean, you may have a low-grade THC product that's like 1%. Typically, that's going to look brownish. 11% THC is going to be our higher grade. And of course, as you can imagine, people are creating even more potent things. About 50% of confiscated marijuana is this, Sinsemilla. Looking at marijuana's history, the earliest mention is about 2737 BC, Chinese pharmacy books. They recommended medicinal uses. In about 1000 AD, social use of the plant had spread to the Muslim world and to North Africa. This word hashishia was a religious cult that carried out a lot of political murders, and it was actually the origin of the word assassin came from this group. It's kind of interesting. Hashish use was mentioned frequently in books like the Arabian Nights. Okay. 1926. Series of newspaper articles come out and they link marijuana to crime. And again, there's this idea that, there are these people out there that are using marijuana and they're destroying things and they're having these violent crimes, which is interesting because the actual data would show that crime rates and marijuana use, well, marijuana use is actually associated with lower crime rates. Alcohol use associated with higher crime rates, right? As to where if you're using alcohol and somebody irritates you, you're probably going to punch them, right? Because your frontal lobe's not working so well there. With marijuana use, if somebody irritates you, you're probably going to be too lazy to get up and punch them, right? You're probably just going to be like, right? Okay. But public interest increased because of these newspaper articles, right? All states by 1936 had laws regulating the use, the sale, and or the possession of marijuana. Most early regulation efforts based their concern about use on criminal behavior. These were concerns. There was no direct evidence. Okay, so then in 1937 we have this thing called the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. It followed that regulation by taxation theme of that 1914 Harrison Act that you are so familiar with already. Now, so at this point, the grower, the distributor, and the seller were all taxed. Administratively, really difficult to deal in cannabis because of all of these taxes. Okay, currently in places where marijuana has been legalized, they are taking taxes on this, and they are making a ton of money. They meaning the state, the cities, a ton of money. Again, I'm not saying that I think there are all pros to legalizing. There is a fact that they're making a lot of money that they're then able to use for things. But state laws made possession and use illegal at a point, okay? In 1969, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that the Marijuana Tax Act was unconstitutional, okay? So, after this, the cost of marijuana increased significantly. The LaGuardia report in 1944 concluded that marijuana use had less serious effects than commonly believed, but people were mad about this, and they didn't want to hear it, and they were like, you guys, this is your agenda, this is BS, it's bad. We've decided it's bad, it's bad. Marijuana use increased throughout the 1950s and the 1960s and peaked in the 1970s. Okay, that shouldn't be a surprise. Marijuana use decreased in the 80s, which is interesting because most drug use peaked in the 80s. Marijuana, it actually decreased in the 80s and rose again in the 90s. Okay. Now, the chemistry of cannabis is pretty complex. There are actually more than 400 different chemicals in marijuana. I use the word chemicals. Sometimes people will be like, well, it's natural, man. Yeah, it's everything technically comes from something natural, doesn't make it good for you. You can call them chemicals. Okay. There are about 70 different cannabinoids. THC is the most pharmacologically active cannabinoid. Okay. It was actually synthesized in 1964. And now when you synthesize that drug, then it can be used in very regulated ways for research, for medical uses, for things like that. Major active metabolite is this 11-hydroxy-delta-9 THC. Okay. Here's a picture of our cannabinoid chemicals. Okay. Pharmacology. So, after it is smoked, which is still the most common method, although some people are using different things now. So, similar to the e-cigarettes, there is also a THC, it's like an oil type of preparation that is then used and vaporized. So, that's sort of, they call it a vape pen, and it's just like a little pen-looking thing that it looks like you're smoking, but you're smoking vapor, so it's not as bad for your lungs. Anyway, after smoking, so getting it in that way, THC is absorbed rapidly by the blood, it travels to the brain, and then to the rest of the body. Peak mood-altering and cardiovascular effects occur within 5 to 10 minutes, so it is quick. After oral administration, now, so this is people will take the marijuana and turn it into butter or turn it into things and then bake with this. So they bake the product typically, but oral administration, it's absorbed much slower, right, because it has to go through the stomach. This peak effects are going to occur about 90 minutes following ingestion. One issue that people have with this is that they consume a certain amount, not really knowing how much they're getting in that product, not really knowing how it's going to affect them specifically, and sometimes people end up being too high and not liking it. Now, what do you do if somebody is too high? What are the dangers? Well, people are unhappy, and what you're supposed to do is talk them down. So talk to them calmly, let them know they'll be okay. And as long as it was just marijuana and not like some other drug in there, they will be fine medically, and they will be fine psychologically as soon as they feel the effects go away. But this is, you know, people do have to be careful with this because once you ingest it, it's in there. Okay. Metabolism, THC's half-life is really long. If you think back on the other drugs we've talked about, THC half-life is about 19 hours. Complete elimination of THC takes like 2 to 3 weeks. Okay, this is something that is likely to show up on a drug test because it stays in your system for so long. THC binds to 2 receptors, the CB1 and the CB2. The CB1 receptors are found primarily in the brain, but also throughout the body. There's a high density in specific brain regions, like the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, which is movement and coordination. The hippocampus, of course, is memory for schooling types of things. The cerebral cortex, higher cognitive functions, and the nucleus accumbens, which is our reward system. So it's affecting all of these different things. The CB2 receptors are found primarily outside of the brain and actually in the immune cells. There's a potential role of cannabinoids in the modulation of the immune system. Okay. Cardiovascular effects are really dose dependent. It does seem to increase heart rate, but the time course really depends on the route of administration and how much is being taken. So this is somebody smoking from a pipe. And again, if you're not familiar with this, you would put the little resins at the top of this and then light it on fire and inhale the smoke. You're probably going to see reddening of the eyes, dryness of the mouth and throat. Acute pulmonary effects are going to be things like effects on breathing, the acute meaning right now. Chronic over time effects are going to be heavy marijuana smoking over a long period of time could lead to significant impairment of pulmonary function. When these studies have come out recently that they talk about regular users, read more specifically what they call a regular user. A regular user in a lot of these studies means that they are smoking at least 11 times a week. Okay, and they are smoking, I think it said like 3 joints or something like that at each time. It was something that most people would not just call a regular user, but most people would think of that as a serious user. Okay, so when they look at people who smoke very moderately or minimally, and that would be once a month, even once a week, a moderate amount, they don't see problems with pulmonary function. They don't see problems with lung function. Again, not advocating. There is one study out there that showed people who had moderate use of marijuana actually had better lung functioning than those who didn't use it all. Now, this does not mean that marijuana use made their lungs better. It could be that people that are good at doing things in moderation also exercise and, do everything else in moderation and have better lung functioning, or who knows, there's lots of different explanations. But there's that. It does not seem to have the same effects as smoking cigarettes because people that smoke cigarettes smoke, 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 smoke. People that smoke this type of a product smoke a lot less often. And also now there are different options for ingesting, whether that is vaporizing or eating products. Anyway. Behavioral effects. So self-administration. That means, in these like animal studies typically. Studies show both humans and animals will self-administer smokes and oral THC. So there is a reinforcing value here, or a reinforcing effect. People are wanting more and more and more. Okay? Under controlled laboratory conditions, marijuana cigarettes with higher THC content are preferred. Participants choose more oral THC during periods of social interaction. So this demonstrates that there is a psychological dependence aspect to it. Okay? There is a potential for abuse of THC. And also it shows that cannabis self-administration is influenced by social factors. All right? Subjective effects. People talk about this feeling of euphoria or high or mellowness or hunger or stimulation. Infrequent users experience similar but more intense effects compared to experienced smokers. At high THC concentrations, infrequent users report negative effects like paranoia, paranoia. Food intake. Marijuana and oral THC significantly increase total daily calorie intake, which is not good if you are trying to reduce your calorie intake. If you are someone who, let's say, has been going through cancer treatments and is not eating, or has other issues where you are not eating, something that increases your appetite is helpful. Verbal behavior. Verbal exchanges decrease, but non-verbal social interactions increase. Differences in frequent users. Marijuana disrupts cognitive performance. Slowed cognitive processing. Impaired short-term memory. Impaired inhibitory control. Loss of sustained concentration or vigilance. Impaired visuospatial processing. Okay? For frequent users, it causes less dramatic effects, but there are some slowed cognitive processing. Frequent users, though, may be able to tolerate these cognitive effects. If you've ever known somebody who smokes all the time, sometimes you can't tell, which is not a good thing. It means that their brain is so used to functioning that way, that's just the way that it is. So there's that. Okay. Chronic cognitive effects. So it's difficult to make definitive statements about the effects on long-term cognitive functioning. Studies really have different findings and different interpretations. Evidence seems to suggest that after abstaining for more than a month, even regular marijuana use produces very few effects on cognition. So there's not these long-term broken parts of your brain, again, like there is if you use certain other drugs. Okay, medical uses. So medical use declined before 1937, not before the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, because there were new and better drugs, variability of the product, active ingredient is insoluble in water and therefore can't be injected. And remember, once the hypodermic syringe came out, they really wanted to be able to inject drugs if using it medically. Oral dose has that delayed onset of action. Okay? Now, in the 1970s through now, there's renewed interest in medical uses for glaucoma or cancer treatment, cancer-related nausea, that is, and a lot of other things, HIV, chronic pain. Some people are looking at it as far as different mental health issues. I am hesitant about that. I don't know. I don't know about that. But for certain medical things, there does seem to be a promise of cannabis use. Okay. There is this drug, the brand name is Marinol, and Marinol is an oral THC preparation, and that is used in medical settings. Okay, it's used as an antiemetic. So in 1985, FDA approved for sale to cancer patients experiencing nausea from chemotherapy. Used to stimulate appetite. So in 1993, FDA approved sale to AIDS patients. Okay, and this is FDA approved for these particular things. Now, it is also in some states approved for general medical uses. I went to undergrad and then also lived again in Northern California for a while, and that is a place where medical use is allowed, and it's really easy to get a medical use card. So, you know, a lot of people that I knew had these things, which means that you are allowed to grow a certain number of plants, blah, 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 blah. So it's interesting. You know, I think Alabama is very different than other states, and you know, I can see pros and cons to the different things. There are studies out that are showing that adolescents probably should not be using on a regular basis. They do seem to show changes in brains of adolescents who are using regularly. Again, what they're calling regularly is 11 times a week. That's a lot for a marijuana user. So what they show, though, with people who are using a lot less, mild use, I guess they would call it, they don't see these changes. However, during adolescence, when your brain is changing, you really want to be extra careful about things. Of course, that is also the time where your brain is telling you that you are invincible and don't need to be careful about things. So if you have an adolescent, watch out for them, but know that little use, as data shows, is not actually that harmful unless they do something stupid while using or they get arrested, because this is Alabama. Anyway, it's complicated. Okay. In 1999, the Institute of Medicine issued a report that recommended use of marijuana when certain conditions are met. Failure of currently approved medications, symptoms will be relieved by a rapid onset, treatment is under medical supervision, and oversight strategy for dispensation. Meaning you don't just give it to them, but you give it to them in small doses and this and that. Legal medical use as early as 2012. So 16 states and DC have, this was at the time, legislation allowing medical use. More and more and more states have increased this, allowed for it. Even in Alabama, there have been people fighting to use certain types of marijuana under certain situations. Okay. So tolerance. Tolerance to a lot of marijuana's effects develop after high levels of regular use, and it may not develop uniformly to all effects. Withdrawal. So, in the past, people have said there's no withdrawal. However, new research would suggest that there is a possible withdrawal syndrome that some people experience. Now, that's going to include anxiety, irritability, disrupted sleep, decreased food intake. Some may argue that this is withdrawal. Some may argue that this is people who are using at a high level are using because they experience anxiety, irritability, disrupted sleep, and they're using to self-medicate. So when they stop using, these things come back. Okay. Tends to begin about 1 day after the last dose and lasts about 4 to 12 days. Okay. Toxicity. So acute physiological effects, there is an increased heart rate, possibly risky for someone with a pre-existing cardiovascular disorder, similar to caffeine can be. There's not a single human overdose death that's been reported. Maybe there has been one, but there hasn't been a single one that anybody knows of. Now, chronic lung exposure, and this is what I was kind of talking about before. Most recent research indicates that marijuana is not associated with respiratory symptoms or lung disease. Marijuana smoke may contain the carcinogens found in tobacco smoke, but it's not really clear whether marijuana smokers are at increased risk for cancer. There's not data to support it, but there's not data to say it's absolutely not a risk. Reproductive effects, though, okay? Reduced testosterone levels in men, this is of regular users. Diminished sperm counts, abnormal sperm in men. Men who are wanting to reproduce often are asked to abstain from marijuana use for a certain amount of time before engaging in sexual activity that could lead to a pregnancy. Okay. Marijuana use by pregnant women does not appear to be associated with negative birth outcomes. However, the act of smoking anything does affect your lung functioning temporarily, and that's not good for pregnancy. But there don't seem to be any big things that people are seeing. Immune system effects. Findings are mixed. So some evidence that marijuana use reduces immunity to infection. Mortality data do not show a relationship between marijuana use and overall death rate. Okay. There's more and more data all the time on these medical findings. So if you're interested in this, feel free to look things up. Be careful what websites you go to, though, because people have agendas. Like, everybody has an agenda. Either they're pro, they want marijuana 100% legalized, or they don't. They want it completely illegal. And there's some people in between. So you need to really look to see that you're reading peer-reviewed research. Anxiety. Characterized by a fear of loss of control, that paranoia feeling. Some people may seek medical treatments like a sedative, but the best treatment seems to be talking them down. Amotivational syndrome, there's this idea that people that use marijuana on a regular basis may have this amotivational syndrome. The data in the lab don't actually support this hypothesis. It seems, though, that people with diminished motivation probably like marijuana. So there's that. Driving ability. Laboratory studies find significant impairment in infrequent users. Epidemiological studies. The reason it says little evidence for impairment is that, honestly, people who are high don't always choose to go driving somewhere, right? Like, they don't feel like, oh, you know where we need to go, unless it's like we need to go to Taco Bell. But typically you can get something delivered, or you have something at your house already, or you can walk somewhere. But there's not that much evidence because people aren't driving fast, they're actually driving slow. But people should not be driving. You should not be driving if you've used this drug, period. Okay. You know that there is there's a cookie delivery here in Birmingham? You can get cookies delivered to your house. And there's some place in 5 Points. That's awesome, right? Okay. Marijuana madness. Some studies have found a correlation between marijuana and psychotic symptoms. However, most likely this is that people that have psychosis are choosing to use marijuana. Okay. Or there may be other drugs going on. There is evidence that marijuana can increase the likelihood of psychotic episodes. So if you're someone who has bipolar disorder with possible psychosis, or someone who has had schizophrenia, or has someone with schizophrenia, a relative with schizophrenia that's close genetically, you probably want to avoid using marijuana. If you've had psychotic episodes before, you probably don't want to use this drug because it could increase the likelihood of future psychotic episodes. Okay. And that's really all I'm going to say. Like I said, there's a lot of data out there. It continues to change. It continues to be updated. People's opinions are strong about these things. I expect you guys to be smart consumers of data. Do not just go to a website and believe whatever they say. Go to a peer-reviewed journal. And then when you read the article, notice who funded the research. Notice what other kinds of things is this person working on. You know, is there a bias there? Hopefully not, but maybe there is. People do have to, you know, disclose on their articles if they have gotten funding from certain agencies. But think about this in a smart way. I guess that's it. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye.